This interview is a collaboration between two different WKTV programs, WKTV Voices, where we record stories from people in the community in general, and Veterans Oral History, where we specifically record the stories of area veterans. We're talking today with Pat Piechocki of Caledonia, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Pat, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born 1968 in Traverse City, Michigan.
Okay, and did you grow up there, or did you move around?
No, I grew up in the Grand Rapids area, Wyoming specifically.
Okay, and what did your family do for a living when you were growing up?
My mother was a telephone operator with Michigan Bell, and my dad worked at a label company downtown Grand Rapids.
Okay, and where did you go to high school?
I went to Lee High School in Wyoming.
Okay, and when did you graduate?
1986.
Okay, and then what did you do after you got out of high school?
I started attending college at Grand Rapids Junior College at the time, and began working at my current employer, Spartan Nash, 32 years ago, and then eventually moved on to Davenport University to finish up my education.
Okay, and how did you wind up in the service?
Well, I guess I'd have to thank the movie Top Gun, really. Just kind of was an inspiration to go into the military, and at the time I was 22 years old, not much really going on in life other than job and school, and it seemed like an adventure. So.
Okay, and so with whom did you enlist, and how did you go about it?
I enlisted myself, and I initially wanted to do the Navy, and my parents basically tried to give me some guidance, and thought maybe the National Guard might be a better option. They weren't real keen about going to war, so they thought perhaps the National Guard would be a safer option.
Okay.
And not knowing what I really wanted to do at the time, I thought that might be the best bet. So I enlisted with the Michigan Army National Guard.
Okay, and so that's 1990?
That was 1988.
88, okay, all right, yeah. And so at that point, well, I don't know, was there much of a prospect of going to war with anybody at that point?
No, not at all. Not that I was aware of at the time, and of course it had been a couple years before the Gulf War began. So
right. Okay. So now, basically, you go. Now, when you went to enlist in the Guard, how did that process work?
I remember going to a recruiter downtown Grand Rapids, and we did, after signing up and doing the vocational testing, I got the results back that I was pretty much eligible for a more technical role. I worked in the computer department with my employer at the time, so it seemed to make sense. So I looked at options there and moved into telecommunications.
Okay. And now, do they send you off for basic training?
They did. I attended that in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and followed that up with schooling in Fort Gordon, Georgia.
Okay. Now, describe basic training in 1988. What was that like?
Oh, wow. Basic training. I think it was at the time, I think it was 8 weeks of basic training. And that was, again, something I didn't know how I would do and if I could do it. So that was an adventure in and of itself. But Fort Jackson was, I think, a quality establishment. I remember my drill sergeants clearly, and overall I thought a very positive experience.
Okay. Positive experience and basic training don't usually go together in the same thing. I mean, so
Yeah.
how did it actually, I mean, were they still shouting at you and that kind of thing?
Yeah, they were. Just that, they made me a soldier. The training was very realistic. Everything from gas chamber training, night rounds, night fire, crawling under barbed wire fences, hand-to-hand combat training, and then also some more of the technical lesson plans that soldiers have to go through as well. So.
Okay. Now, in general, part of what the military tries to do is to kind of break people down and build them back up again.
Yeah.
So were they doing that in basic training?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely from a physical aspect. The physical training with the running and the push-ups and sit-ups. That was just, you just build yourself up, and you build your body, you build your mind. They took care of the mind. The drill sergeants, they condition the soldiers. So.
Okay. And then what about sort of the discipline end of things?
The discipline end. Yeah, I ended up going in at a higher rank because I had some college, so I ended up becoming a squad leader in basic training, which at first I thought was great until we if there were any failures, it was all my accountability, and they were very clear about that. So, I know at some point we ended up paying the price with push-ups if things didn't go quite right, that kind of thing. So.
Okay. Now, did you have an understanding of what they were doing or how the system worked, or did you just kind of do whatever they told you?
I kind of had it going in that it was going to be a bit of a head game, and to keep that in mind that they're doing their job, and everybody seemed to fare differently. Some soldiers it was easier for some than others. Some were a real challenge, and some actually cycled out because it was too much for them, or they had to go through and do it over again.
Okay. Now, were there some who simply couldn't handle it physically?
Yes, there was one I recall that couldn't handle it physically. That was difficult.
Okay. And now, were you a little bit older than most of the other guys?
Yeah, by a year or two. Yeah. I was 20 when I went into basic training, so yeah.
Okay, that and a little bit of college, so a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, were there some older guys there?
Yes, we did have one individual who went back in through basic training. He had been inactive, and he got activated again. So he came in with a little bit of an attitude. Mm-hmm. Wasn't looking forward to going through it again, but he was over 30, mm-hmm. and he was the oldest one of the group.
Okay, all right. So you sort of get through that. Now, over the course of those 8 weeks in basic training, do you have much of any contact with the outside world, or they just keep you closed in?
Pretty much closed in. We had opportunities for phone calls home. We did get some R&R, I think, close to graduation. That was from school. Mm-hmm. We did have a Christmas break where we're allowed to go home from school for Christmas break and come back, so that was nice.
Okay. All right. So you do your 8 weeks before Jackson, okay, and then your next stage?
Yeah, the next stage was 10 weeks at Fort Gordon for telecommunications school.
Okay. And what were you actually doing there?
Well, my actual MOS was a 72 Echo as a tactical telecommunications specialist, and the role actually was working with teletypes. I actually went to school and took classes for teletype operations and repair. At the time, that seemed to be one of the most technical jobs that were offered in my particular unit here in Michigan with the National Guard.
Okay. Now, explain. Now, this is now kind of aging technology. Explain what a teletype system is.
Well, as I recall, we basically had a way to encode messages, encrypt them, typing codes and sending transmissions from one point to another.
Being a teletype operator, does that require a certain minimum typing speed or anything like that, or?
I don't recall, honestly. It was more along the lines of just encoding messages, encrypting them, and being able to decode them as needed.
All right. And would this be something that one would do with a unit out in the field, or would you be in a headquarters someplace? Or?
Usually in a headquarters someplace. We didn't really work with any of the devices in the field.
Okay. All right. And how was life in the school different from life in basic training?
Well, we had a little bit more freedom to move around, more activities in addition to the classwork, but there was also some of the similar responsibilities in the barracks and reporting to a drill sergeant, and there was still, of course, the physical requirements.
Right.
As well.
Okay. So you're still getting PT and you're
Yes.
still running and that kind of thing. Okay. How long did the school last?
10 weeks.
Okay. And was this over? This one was over Christmas, or was that the basic?
No, it was Christmas break for the school.
Okay.
So yeah.
All right. And now, once you complete that, you're a guardsman. So they just send you home at this point, and
Yes.
okay. Now, what then is the routine for you with a National Guard unit when you're, I guess, what's your status? Is that active reserve? Or
Right. No, it's I guess you could say it's active duty. We were required to do 1 weekend a month, and then our 2-week active duty in the summer.
Okay. And in those weekends, what would you do?
We would basically do maintenance repairs on our existing equipment, and then also do any work that needed to be done at the location where we did drill, and I served with the headquarters company, 46th Brigade in Wyoming. So most of our activities took place in the Armory in Wyoming.
Okay. And then did you do a 2-week summer thing with them? Or?
Yes, we spent most of that time. It was either up at Camp Grayling here in Michigan or down in Indiana. Can't remember the name of the base at this time, but yeah, we spent time down there as well.
Okay. And when you're doing an exercise like that, I mean, what are you doing?
Well, we would bivouac out in the woods, setting up a communications center, providing guard duty, in addition to also making sure we did some PT, and we'd also do some other training as well, and weapons qualifications would usually be done at summer camp, if you call it that.
Okay. Now, with your guard unit that you were with initially, what kind of mix of people were in it in terms of ages or backgrounds or anything else?
You know, I seem to recall there being most of the guys were older than me and had been in the Guard for quite some time. I was one of the new guys. And it was, some of them were full-time National Guard, and a lot of different operating units within the headquarters company. My platoon was specifically communications.
Was there anybody there who'd been in Vietnam?
Yes, we had some Vietnam veterans there as well.
Okay, because it's not as long ago as it is now. So you're talking, 1988, 89, and so forth. I mean, we had left, Vietnam 15, 16 years before. So
yeah,
there would still be some who remembered that. Okay. Now, eventually, during the time when you're in the Guard, the Gulf War happens. Saddam Hussein decides to invade Kuwait in 1990 and make that the 21st province of Iraq. And pretty quickly after that, you get an international response that builds up forces in Saudi Arabia and then starts a war in 91. Now, at what point in this process does that start to affect you, or do you start to think about maybe we'll have to go someplace?
Well, I know there was some question as to whether our unit within the headquarters company was going to be activated to go overseas. And I don't recall anything specific about that. I was actually contacted about filling a spot with a Lansing detachment to go overseas, and they needed a position filled that also had some computer skills, and I was recommended for the spot and offered to go. So.
Now, was this after Saddam had gone into Kuwait and there was a situation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this was the build-up for Desert Shield.
Right.
I think we went over in September. We started in August, and we finally got over there with training. We had a few weeks of training, so first week of October we arrived overseas.
Okay. Now, where in the States did you train?
We trained in Indiana, and then also in Massachusetts. I think we trained for a few days before we left the country.
So they're not really training you for a desert at that point?
No.
Didn't send you to El Paso or something? Okay.
No.
All right. So you train, okay. Now you just joined a new, was this just a small detachment you were part of, or?
Yes, it was a transportation control team, 12 individuals based out of Lansing, so kind of a brand new unit for me. I was the new guy.
Okay.
But there were 2 others that also joined that unit from other units as well, so kind of became our own group.
Okay. So often Guard units don't have a full complement of people in every specialization, and if you do mobilize them, you bring in people from other units.
Yes.
So that's happening to you. Okay. And now, what did your family think of all this?
I remember my mom was not happy about it, did not want me to be activated, and but it was something where, they called me and asked, and I just felt like I had to. That's duty. So
that's what you signed up for.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. So what's the process now for getting you out to the Middle East?
Well, they basically, after the training's done, we boarded, I think it was C-5A, and flew overseas, and I think we had a stop in Spain, and then we flew into Saudi Arabia and began our first mission was at a local car dealership we were actually assigned to. So we set up tents outside the perimeter of the building, and we operated out of that location for several weeks.
Okay. Now, were there other Army units there around you, or?
Yes. Well, we were attached with the 101st Corps Support Group, so that was their main base, and we just kind of moved in. And then as time went on, we, depending on the mission, we moved from place to place, and I think we had 3 or 4 different locations that we were based at throughout the experience. So.
Okay. So you said your initial position was in a car dealership. So were there Saudi civilians around, or had they all been cleared out?
No, there were Saudi civilians around. We worked hand in hand with them. They helped a great deal as far as us, basically being comfortable, having a place to work in. The officers were within the dealership. They had office space to do the work they needed to do. And many of the soldiers were outside, like on the lot in tents. And that's where we stayed in the whole complex was surrounded by a wall, so we had some level of protection there. So.
Okay. Now, the equipment you were using, did that need to be in climate-controlled conditions, or could that just be right out in the heat?
It was right out in the heat. At the time, we worked with an old Burroughs PCs, and I recall using those in the desert, powered by generator, getting dust in them, sand in them, so it was not optimal.
All right. And while you're out there, because it's sort of several months between when you arrive and when the war, such as it is, happens, was there did you pay attention to the news, or did you have information, or did you just do what they told you and wait?
Basically, we did what they told us and waited. We did have access to the Stars and Stripes newspaper. We did not have internet access back then, or even television access where we were. So there were many times where people back home knew more than I did at a given point in time, based on current activities. So.
Okay. One of the features of that buildup period was the Iraqi use of Scud missiles. Did any of those come anywhere near where you were?
I could hear activity, but I was I'd like to say safely in Saudi Arabia at the time. There was some concern about, them attacking into Saudi Arabia, but most of the activity took place in Iraq.
Okay. Well, but there were missiles that were shot at major bases and so forth inside Saudi Arabia. That was the stuff we were watching on the news and
Sure.
you didn't get to see.
Yeah.
But that wasn't affecting you.
Not personally, no.
Okay. And what kind of, did you work with the Saudi military or with any other foreign military groups?
Primarily the Saudi military. I know a few of us did some guard duty at the King Fahd Air Base, and mostly working with civilians. I'd say even more so than the military from time to time.
Okay. And what did you need them for?
Basically, if we had to get supplies of any type, that was pretty much about it.
Okay. Now, as you get closer to the time when the actual fighting takes place, were there changes that you could observe, or new things that you were doing, or things that were done differently?
Yeah, there was a period of time where it was kind of a hurry up and wait, and we did have a lot of time on our hands for a while as we got in place. We had our base set up, but we started to, I think, to dig in a little more, fortify things a little more.
So we've gotten your story now to the point where it's looking like something is going to happen. You're moving around, a bunch of stuff happens, and then you sit around and nothing happens. And at this point, are you still on a fixed base someplace, or are you out in a tent in the middle of the desert, or where are you?
We were out in tents in the middle of the desert. We started off in the town of Dharan, and we ultimately moved out to a base called Guardian City. And we were attached out there with several other units. There was an engineering team out there, and we established basically our tents that we lived in, and then we also worked out of some remodeled trailers. And so we were able to establish offices in a communications center that ran 24/7.
Okay. Now, before the actual fighting happens, what kinds of problems did you have to deal with while you're out there in these bases?
If anything, just to get our procedures established and making sure that we were following everything that we needed to handle, everything from security, making sure that we had proper passwords, primary objective of ours was tasking convoys throughout Saudi Arabia. So we had schedules that needed to be handled. We had to make sure phones were set up to be able to communicate. So.
Okay. What about things like just physical conditions, like heat, dust?
Yes, the heat was an issue. When we arrived in country, we were ordered to drink so many liters of water per day. I personally ended up with a little bit of a heat stroke, and I ended up spending some time in the local medical unit. Just got overheated and had to replenish. So.
And you mentioned before that sort of the heat, the dust affecting your equipment and maintenance.
We just had to do our best to keep them clean, keep them covered. But the dust over there, the sand is like talcum powder, and so it was very fine. And if the wind picked up, it just became a bit of a challenge. So it didn't cause anything to break per se, but we tried to keep things clean.
Okay.
Weapons probably were the most of an issue. We had covers for our M16s, but just making sure that those didn't get too dirty.
Okay. And how do they feed you out there?
We did have MREs. We ate meals ready to eat. Sometimes we would just place them up on top of the tents and let them cook in the sun. Other times we did have a food tent that we were able to get meals through. And a few times we actually went into the local town and ate at a restaurant, or perhaps at a military base if we were close by.
Okay. And then do you get any chance to call home or communicate back home, or is that all just incognito for a while?
We did have an opportunity to call home. We wrote letters, of course. We would go into town, and sometimes we were able to do a long-distance phone call. But we didn't have cell capability back then. So.
Okay. And then, as things are about to happen, you moved around. Is it just one day somebody just announces, "Okay, this is it"?
No, actually, we were paying attention to whatever updates we could get, and we did listen to news from time to time. When President Bush announced the declaration of war, I remember it was nighttime, and we were kind of gathered around the radio listening to his speech, and just getting very excited about it, I guess. And I don't know necessarily mean in a positive way, but there was just a lot of energy because it's really going to happen now. We're actually going to be in a war, as opposed to just the buildup we've been doing. So once that happened, everything just kind of like changed gears, and then it became Desert Storm, and we kind of, instead of the defensive, we were now on the offensive.
Okay. So now, what were you doing, or what do you remember about those few days?
I remember security ramped up considerably. Our procedures that we had in our office areas, they just got really tightened down. We had strict procedures to follow. Guard duty was ramped up. We had guards posted 24/7. We were doing drills with our gas masks because we knew that Saddam Hussein was doing some of the biological warfare, or chemical warfare, I should say. So we practiced with that. Just the whole demeanor just got real serious real quick.
Okay. And now, are you routing or communicating with units that are heading into Kuwait and Iraq at this point now?
Yes. Yeah. We're tasking convoys through Saudi Arabia and into Iraq or possibly Kuwait. We worked closely with some of the French forces that were located there at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, that was pretty much our main job.
All right. And what kind of information did you get about what was actually happening?
As far as what was going on with the war at the time, again, we got information from the newspaper and any communication from our superiors about what was going on. Basically, we were just told if we had to move to the next point, we were packing up and going to that next location. And there were some times where we were set up in front of the units that we were tasking, and then bring them in through us or ahead of us. So there were a few times where we felt like, well, there's nothing between us and the enemy. It's pretty. We were out at one place, I think it was called Rafah, and it was just like being on the moon. There was just nothing there. So a lot of activity to prepare, and then once we brought the convoys through and got them to their destinations, and we were effectively again behind the lines. So.
Okay. Now, these convoys, were they? Did they have combat units in them, or were they supply and support?
Mostly supply and support.
Okay. So probably there was a combat unit up there someplace in front of you.
Yes. Yeah.
that point.
Mhm.
Okay. And did you sense pretty quickly that things were going maybe better than expected, or were going well, or?
I do recall the knowing about the fires that took place in Iraq, and he had the oil wells lit, and we could see that off in the distance. We could hear the bombs, the thuds off in the distance as well. Helicopters flying close by. A lot of there was a main road in Saudi Arabia that had Apaches flying back and forth up and down that road all day, all night. So it was a lot of activity going on for sure. So.
All right. And then at a certain point, the Iraqis simply give up.
Yes.
Does that change the pattern at that point?
It does. It made sense in a way that their communications were knocked out, and soldiers were unable to communicate with their superiors. I think they were in a situation where they didn't know what was going on, so they just, I'm done. It was surprising, and I really thought the war would last a little bit longer than what it did. But it was over quickly.
Okay. Now, having the shooting stop, though, doesn't really end your involvement there. Once there is an armistice or the shooting stops, what does your unit then do?
Well, we kind of did kind of the reverse of what we did with the buildup. We had to move troops out and back to the ports in Dharan and back to the airports. So we tasked convoys back and coordinated things before we ultimately shipped out. I don't recall if we were replaced with any other units, but we left country in April. So we were there a total of 7 months.
All right. And then how do they get you back home?
Took a plane home, basically, and then we ended up at a base and we did debriefing, and then we just arrived back home here in Michigan.
Okay. Now, is there a reception for you when you get back?
There was. The city of Lansing put on quite an event right in downtown. Those of us in our unit received a key to the city as a thank you because of the local detachment based out of Lansing, Michigan. I do recall there being Vietnam veterans there at the ceremony and an acknowledgement of those veterans at the time, which we thought was very cool. So, but yeah, it was really nice. And again, having known some of the treatment of Vietnam veterans prior to that, it was a welcome sight to see that, and it felt good to come home.
Okay. Now, to think back to the time that you actually spent in Saudi Arabia and Iraq, are there other particular incidents or memories that stand out for you that you haven't brought into the story yet?
No, I do recall a time where we had civilians inquiring about our base location, and they kept asking questions on where we were, and we wouldn't tell them, and they just kept asking, and I remember our sergeant had to make it very clear, and at one point I think a weapon actually got locked and loaded to get this guy to stop talking. It just became very uncomfortable very quickly, but no action ever took place. So.
Okay. Now, was this when you were out in the community someplace, or?
Yes, we were out in the community. We were in a local store in a town, and the gentleman seemed very friendly. He just wouldn't stop asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay. All right. Now, once you get back, now at this point, you get back to Lansing. Everybody just goes home, goes back to work.
Yeah, we just went back to regular National Guard schedule in terms of getting together 1 weekend a month, and I believe I stayed attached to that unit for several weeks as we basically took care of equipment, and then transferred back to my headquarters unit in Wyoming.
Okay. And then how long did you stay in the Guard?
I was actually activated for 3 years, and then I was inactive for 5 years. That was the option I chose when I signed up.
Okay.
So I went inactive actually right after we got back in April. That following July, I went to inactive status.
Okay.
So.
And then at that point, did anything else then happen that required you to be called back, or think that you might have to go back?
No, not at the time.
Okay. So I guess about all that's going, there's stuff going on. We can go to Somalia, and I think we begin to get into what was Yugoslavia and things like that. But your unit wasn't
my particular unit was not. And again, being in an active status, I guess there were a few times I wondered if I might be reactivated, but it never happened.
Okay. All right. Now, if you kind of look at over your time in the service, your experiences there, how do you think those have affected you, or what have you taken out of it?
Well, I think I went into the military because I wanted to see if I could do it. I think it helped me to grow up and gave me a sense of responsibility, and just I don't know. It was for me. I think it was a positive experience, and a personal challenge.
And when 9/11 happened, did you give any thought to going back in, or?
I wanted to. I thought about it a lot in terms of just, if there were an opportunity to be activated again. I was married with one child at the time, so that that also is in the back of your mind. But yeah, when something like that happens, I think every veteran in this country wanted to do their part. So.
All right. Well, that makes for a good story. So I'd just like to thank you for taking the time to share it today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And that'll do it.
Yeah.
There.